Hi.
I've always loved the sky. Flying wasn't just a job for me. It was a passion, something that set my soul alight every time I climbed into the cockpit and felt the rumble of the engines beneath me. I used to say that being a pilot made me feel closer to freedom, like I had the world beneath my feet and nothing could weigh me down. That's why meeting Emily felt like a perfect balance. She was my grounding force, the person who made coming back down to earth feel like coming home. We met 7 years ago at a small restaurant near the airport where I was stationed for a time. She was there with friends, celebrating a birthday, and I was having dinner alone after a long shift. We struck up a conversation while waiting for our meals, me in uniform, her with a glass of wine in hand and a laugh that felt like it could fill the room. By the end of the evening, I'd given her my number, and she'd promised to call. She did, and the rest, as they say, was history. Emily and I built a life together that felt effortless, at least at first. She worked as an interior designer, her creativity always spilling over into our personal lives. When we moved in together 2 years into our relationship, our apartment quickly became her canvas. She turned the plain walls into a masterpiece of comfort and warmth, filling the space with little details that spoke to who we were as a couple. A framed photo of our first trip together sat on the mantel. A ceramic airplane she'd bought for me rested on the bookshelf. Our relationship had its challenges, of course. Being a pilot meant long hours, frequent travel, and sometimes weeks away from home. It wasn't easy on Emily, and I knew it. She'd joke about being a pilot's widow, but beneath her teasing, I could sense the loneliness that came with my absences. I tried to make up for it when I was home, planning romantic evenings, surprise getaways, and lazy Sundays spent tangled up on the couch watching movies. For a long time, it felt like enough. We got married 5 years ago in a small ceremony by the lake where we'd shared our first kiss. It was the happiest day of my life. Emily looked stunning in her dress, her smile brighter than the sun reflecting off the water. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who loved me despite the unconventional lifestyle my job demanded. I promised myself that I'd do everything I could to make her happy, even if it meant balancing my love for flying with my love for her. The first few years of marriage were everything I'd hoped they'd be. Emily's career flourished, and she'd often excitedly tell me about her latest projects when I called her from hotel rooms on layovers. I'd share stories about my flights, the passengers I'd met, and the cities I'd visited. Even though we spent a lot of time apart, we stayed connected through texts, calls, and little notes we'd leave for each other around the house. Coming home to her was always the highlight of my trips. No matter how tired I was, seeing her waiting for me made everything else fade away. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. It wasn't sudden. It was more like a gradual shift, so subtle at first that I barely noticed it. Emily started seeming distracted when I came home, her hugs less warm, her smiles a little forced. She still listened to my stories about work, but her responses felt distant, like her mind was somewhere else. I chalked it up to stress. Her job had become more demanding, and she'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed by some of her clients. Then there were the little things. The way she'd spend more time on her phone, often turning the screen away from me when I walked into the room. The excuses about being too tired to go out or too busy to join me for dinner. The nights when she'd work late at her office, something she'd rarely done before. I told myself not to overthink it. We'd been together for years, and relationships went through phases. This was just a rough patch, nothing more. The first real crack appeared about a year ago. I'd just come back from a week-long flight rotation, excited to surprise Emily by coming home a day earlier than planned. When I walked into the house, I noticed a wine glass on the coffee table, next to an empty bottle. It wasn't unusual for Emily to enjoy a glass of wine after work, but there were 2 glasses. When I asked her about it later, she said a friend had stopped by, someone from work who'd needed advice on a project. Her explanation seemed reasonable, and I didn't push further. But after that, I started noticing more things that didn't add up. An unfamiliar jacket draped over the back of a chair, the faint smell of cologne that wasn't mine lingering in the bedroom. Emily always had an explanation. A coworker had borrowed her office and left their jacket behind. The cologne was from a sample a client had given her. Her answers made sense, but they never quite settled the unease that had begun to creep into my mind. I'd always prided myself on being a trusting husband, someone who didn't let jealousy or insecurity dictate my actions. But the more these small inconsistencies piled up, the harder it became to ignore the voice in my head whispering that something wasn't right. I started paying closer attention to Emily's behavior, looking for patterns or clues that might explain what was going on. One day, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. A text popped up from someone named A. It was short and vague, something about meeting later. I knew I shouldn't invade her privacy, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the message thread and found a series of texts that seemed harmless on the surface, discussions about work mostly, but there was a familiarity in the tone that didn't sit right with me. I put the phone down before she could catch me, feeling a mix of guilt and suspicion. The doubts continued to grow over the next few months. I'd come home from flights to find the house feeling different, like I was stepping into someone else's life. Emily would greet me with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She'd ask about my trips, but her interest felt obligatory, as if she were going through the motions. I started to wonder if I was imagining things, if my own insecurities were creating problems where none existed. But then there was the cologne. It was subtle at first, a faint trace on the pillowcases or the sheets. I'd ask Emily about it, and she'd laugh, saying it must be from the samples her clients gave her. She'd always had a keen sense of smell and liked to experiment with different scents, so her explanation made sense. But the more I noticed it, the harder it became to believe her. The scent wasn't random. It was the same each time, a distinct, musky cologne that I'd never worn. One night, as I lay awake in bed beside her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I thought about all the little things I'd noticed over the past year, the wine glasses, the jacket, the texts, the cologne. Each one on its own could be explained, but together they painted a picture I didn't want to see. I told myself that I needed proof before jumping to conclusions. Until then, I had to act like everything was normal. So I did. I kissed Emily goodbye when I left for my flights, texted her goodnight from hotel rooms, and brought her souvenirs from the cities I visited. But beneath the surface, I was watching, waiting, and trying to prepare myself for what I feared I might find. After that night of restless thoughts, my suspicions became impossible to ignore. Every detail of my interactions with Emily felt like it carried a double meaning. Every word she spoke was weighed against the mounting evidence in my mind. My life was split in two. The skies where I felt free and purposeful, and the ground where I felt trapped by the uneasy dynamic that had crept into our home. Emily continued to carry herself as though nothing had changed, but the cracks in her facade were more apparent to me now. She'd often get ready to go out with friends while I was preparing for a flight, her outfits more deliberate, her makeup a little bolder. When I asked who she'd be meeting, her responses felt rehearsed, as though she'd planned the answer in advance. I wanted to believe her, but each time, it felt like she was feeding me just enough information to keep me from questioning further. I decided that if I wanted answers, I couldn't rely on her explanations alone. During one of my longer trips, I started keeping a journal, jotting down everything I noticed that seemed unusual. The journal became my way of organizing my thoughts, a place to confront the suspicions that I hadn't yet dared to voice out loud. The entries ranged from seemingly innocent details, an extra charge on her credit card, a text she'd received late at night, to things I couldn't dismiss, like the lingering cologne that had become an almost permanent fixture in our bedroom. It wasn't long before I found myself looking for more concrete proof. I hated the thought of invading Emily's privacy, but the idea that I could be blindsided by the truth if I didn't act felt worse. One evening, when she had gone to bed early claiming a headache, I sat in the living room scrolling through her laptop. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just hoping to find something that might explain the unease that had been gnawing at me for months. The first thing that caught my eye was her email inbox. Most of her messages were work-related, the usual back and forth with clients about design projects. But there was one thread that stood out. The subject line was simple, follow-up, not unusual, but the sender's name wasn't one I recognized. The emails themselves were vague, referencing dinner plans and meetings that didn't sound like they were about work. My chest tightened as I scrolled through them, the tone of the exchanges uncomfortably personal. It wasn't explicit, but there was an intimacy there that felt wrong. I didn't confront Emily immediately. Instead, I forwarded the emails to myself and closed the laptop, returning to bed with my heart pounding. The next morning, I kissed her goodbye as she left for work, all the while trying to act like I wasn't holding on to this damning new piece of evidence. I spent the day combing through the forwarded emails, analyzing every word for clues. The sender's name was Andrew, and based on the context, he seemed to be a client. But the frequency of their messages and the casual tone suggested a connection that went beyond professional boundaries. A week later, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. I returned home from a 2-day trip to find a pair of men's sunglasses on the kitchen counter. They weren't mine, and when I asked Emily about them, she barely looked up from her phone as she explained that they belonged to a coworker who'd stopped by to discuss a project. Her explanation was so casual, so unbothered, that I almost believed her. But something about the way she avoided my gaze made my stomach churn. I nodded and let it go, but I added it to the growing list of anomalies in my journal. By this point, I was no longer just suspicious, I was convinced. I'd always thought of myself as a rational, level-headed person, but the evidence against Emily was stacking up in ways I couldn't ignore. The emails, the sunglasses, the cologne, the late nights. It all pointed to something I didn't want to admit. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront her outright. I needed more. I needed proof that couldn't be explained away with a simple shrug or an offhand comment. My chance came unexpectedly. One night, while Emily was out with friends, I received a call from my airline. They needed me to cover a last-minute flight the next morning, which meant leaving before she got home. I decided to use the opportunity to test a theory. I set up a small camera in the living room, hidden among the books on the shelf. It wasn't something I'd ever imagined myself doing, but desperation has a way of pushing people into corners they never thought they'd find themselves in. When I returned from the trip 2 days later, I retrieved the camera and played back the footage. For the first few hours, the living room remained empty. Then, around 10 p.m., Emily came through the door, laughing. She wasn't alone. A man followed her in, his arm brushing against hers as they moved toward the couch. My chest tightened as I watched them sit together, the man leaning in close as they talked. They didn't kiss or do anything overtly incriminating, but the familiarity between them was undeniable. I paused the video and stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The man was Andrew, the same name from the emails. I didn't need to watch the rest of the footage to know what was happening. My suspicions had been confirmed in the worst way possible. For the next few days, I went through the motions of daily life, trying to decide what to do. Confronting Emily felt inevitable, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed to process what I'd seen, to figure out how to approach the conversation without losing my composure. In the meantime, I continued to gather evidence, not because I needed more proof, but because I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal. I started looking for patterns in her behavior, tracing her movements and comparing them to my flight schedule. It became clear that Andrew's visits weren't random. They almost always coincided with my trips. The realization made my stomach churn. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was planning around my absence, using my job as a way to cover her tracks. The final piece of evidence came one evening when Emily left her phone unlocked on the counter while she showered. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't resist the urge to look. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There were texts from Andrew, confirming not only their relationship but also mocking the idea that I might ever find out. Reading his words made my blood boil. It wasn't just infidelity, it was cruelty. I closed the phone and placed it back where I'd found it, my hands shaking. The time for doubt was over. I knew what I had to do. I'd spent months piecing together the truth, and now it was staring me in the face. Emily wasn't the woman I thought she was, and our marriage wasn't what I'd believed it to be. The life we'd built together was a lie, and there was no going back from that realization. The days following my discovery were a blur of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I had gathered all the evidence I needed to confirm what my instincts had been screaming at me for months. Yet, knowing the truth didn't bring relief. Instead, it left a void, a hollow space where trust and love had once lived. I went through the motions of daily life, speaking to Emily as little as possible while I figured out what to do next. Every smile she gave me felt like a slap, every moment of normalcy a bitter reminder of the betrayal she thought I didn't see. One thing was clear. I couldn't keep pretending forever. I needed a plan. Confronting her impulsively wasn't an option. I didn't want to give her the chance to spin the story or manipulate the situation. I wanted the revelation to be definitive, undeniable, and on my terms. To achieve that, I needed to control the moment, to set the stage so there would be no escaping the truth. I began preparing meticulously, going over the evidence I'd collected. The texts, the emails, the footage from the hidden camera. I stored everything in a secure folder on my laptop, labeled innocuously to avoid suspicion. I also confided in one person, my best friend, Ethan. He had always been my rock during difficult times, and I needed his perspective. When I showed him the evidence, his reaction mirrored my own. Shock, followed by quiet anger. Ethan was the one who suggested I time the confrontation for maximum impact. He pointed out that Emily had carefully planned her affair around my absences, using my job as a shield. If I wanted to confront her, I needed to catch her when she thought I wasn't supposed to be there. The irony of her using my work against me wasn't lost on me, and the idea of turning the tables felt satisfying in a way that was hard to describe. It didn't take long for the perfect opportunity to present itself. I had a scheduled 3-day trip coming up, one that Emily seemed all too eager to discuss. She asked me about my itinerary with casual interest, her tone light and unconcerned. It was the same routine she'd used countless times before, and it only solidified my resolve. I told her everything she wanted to know, feigning the same obliviousness that had kept me blind for so long. The night before my supposed departure, I packed my bags as usual, even double-checking my flight uniform to sell the illusion. Emily kissed me goodnight with the same practiced affection she always used, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. Despite everything, part of me still wanted to believe in the life we'd built. But that part was silenced by the weight of what I'd uncovered. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with. She was someone else entirely. The following morning, I left the house as if heading to the airport. I even drove to the parking lot where I usually left my car, ensuring that if Emily was watching, she'd see nothing out of the ordinary. Once there, I parked in a distant corner out of sight and called Ethan to let him know the plan was in motion. I spent the day in a nearby motel, waiting for the evening to arrive with a mix of nervous anticipation and dread. As the sun began to set, I drove back to the house, parking a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. I approached on foot, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights inside were dim, but I could see the faint glow of the living room lamp through the curtains. I hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Then I walked to the front door and unlocked it as quietly as possible. The house was eerily silent as I stepped inside, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the refrigerator. I moved cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. As I reached the hallway, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. A man's jacket hung over the back of one of the dining chairs. It wasn't mine. I continued down the hallway, stopping just short of the bedroom door. It was ajar and I could hear voices inside. Emily's laughter floated out, light and carefree, followed by a deeper voice I didn't recognize. My hands clenched into fists as I pushed the door open, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might drown out everything else. What I saw confirmed everything I'd feared. Emily was in bed with Andrew, the man from the emails and the camera footage. They froze as the door swung open, their expressions shifting from shock to panic. For a moment, none of us spoke. The room was heavy with the weight of the betrayal, the silence louder than any words could have been. I didn't shout or scream. I didn't throw accusations or demand explanations. Instead, I turned and walked out, leaving them to scramble behind me. Emily called after me, her voice frantic, but I didn't stop. I felt numb, like I was moving through a dream. By the time I reached my car, the numbness began to give way to a searing pain that threatened to consume me. I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. That night I stayed at Ethan's place. He didn't ask for details, just handed me a beer and let me sit in silence. The weight of what I'd seen hung over me like a storm cloud, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, but no amount of preparation could have softened the blow. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow. The anger I'd felt the night before had simmered down, replaced by a cold determination. This wasn't over. Emily and Andrew had underestimated me, thinking they could continue their affair without consequence. But they were about to learn just how wrong they'd been. I spent the day going over the evidence I'd collected, organizing it into a comprehensive file. Emails, texts, footage from the hidden camera. Everything was meticulously documented. I wasn't sure yet how I'd use it, but I wanted to be ready, whether it was for legal action, a confrontation, or simply to protect myself in the aftermath. I needed to ensure there was no room for denial. When I finally returned to the house, Emily was waiting for me. She looked disheveled, her eyes red and puffy as though she'd been crying. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. Instead, I walked past her, heading straight to the bedroom to pack a bag. I couldn't stay here, not after what I'd seen. This wasn't my home anymore. It was just a shell, a place where the life I'd once loved had fallen apart. Leaving the house felt like stepping into a new reality, one where everything I had taken for granted was now upended. The person I had trusted most in the world had betrayed me, and I was left to figure out what came next. But in that moment, all I wanted was distance. Distance from the house, from Emily, from the wreckage of our life together. I drove aimlessly for hours, the roads blurring into one another as my mind raced through 1,000 different emotions. Anger, heartbreak, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. It felt like grief but sharper, like the loss of something that had been stolen rather than lost. By the time I arrived at Ethan's place, it was late. He didn't say much, just opened the door and handed me a cold beer. I sank onto his couch, staring at the bottle in my hand without drinking. The silence between us was heavy, but it was exactly what I needed. Ethan had always known when to push and when to let me sit in my own thoughts. That night, he chose the latter, and I was grateful for it. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollow. The initial shock of what I'd seen had dulled, replaced by a cold, simmering resolve. Emily had made her choices, and now I had to make mine. Staying in that house was out of the question. It was tainted, a physical reminder of her betrayal. But leaving permanently meant more than just walking away. It meant unraveling a life we'd spent years building together. The thought was overwhelming, but I knew it was necessary. There was no going back to the way things were, not after what had happened. Over the next few days, I began taking steps to protect myself. The evidence I'd collected, the texts, emails, and video footage, was meticulously organized and backed up in multiple locations. I contacted a lawyer to discuss my options, explaining the situation in as much detail as I could without letting my emotions take over. The lawyer was professional and direct, outlining the potential outcomes and advising me to keep all communication with Emily civil and documented. It felt clinical, but that was exactly what I needed. A clear, logical path forward. Emily, for her part, seemed to oscillate between guilt and denial. She called me multiple times, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to defensive justifications. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I forwarded the messages to my lawyer, adding them to the growing file of evidence. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about ensuring that I had a complete picture of her behavior in case things escalated. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself replaying the events leading up to the revelation, analyzing every interaction with a new lens. The signs had been there all along. The late nights, the guarded phone, the unfamiliar cologne. But I'd ignored them, convincing myself that my doubts were baseless. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing how much I'd trusted her despite the growing evidence. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. One day, while sorting through some of my belongings at Ethan's place, I came across a photo album Emily had made for our first anniversary. It was filled with pictures of our travels, our friends, our little milestones as a couple. Flipping through the pages felt like a punch to the gut. Every smile, every moment of happiness captured in those photos now felt tainted, like a cruel joke I hadn't been in on. I closed the album and set it aside, deciding then and there that I wouldn't let myself dwell on the past any longer. It was time to move forward. Moving forward, however, was easier said than done. The logistics alone were daunting. Dividing our assets, figuring out what to do with the house, and disentangling our lives from one another. But the emotional weight of it was even heavier. Every decision felt like a small death, a reminder of the life I'd thought we were building together. Still, I pushed through, one step at a time, determined not to let her betrayal define me. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected email. It was from Andrew, the man I'd found in bed with Emily. Seeing his name in my inbox sent a jolt of anger through me, but curiosity won out. The email was short, almost clinical. He claimed he hadn't known I'd be home that night and apologized for the situation escalating the way it did. But what struck me most was his final line. "There are things you don't know about Emily." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What could he possibly mean? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the email and move on without giving him the satisfaction of a response. But another part of me, the part that needed closure, couldn't let it go. Against my better judgment, I replied, asking him to explain. His response came quickly, and what he told me left me reeling. Andrew claimed that his relationship with Emily hadn't started as an affair. According to him, they'd met through mutual connections and had initially bonded over professional interests. But over time, their connection had deepened, and Emily had confided in him about issues in our marriage that I hadn't even been aware of. He painted a picture of Emily as someone who felt trapped, lonely, and unfulfilled, seeking comfort in a relationship that offered her an escape from her reality. I didn't know how much of his story to believe. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as self-serving justification, but another part couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to it. Had Emily really been unhappy? And if so, why hadn't she talked to me about it? The questions gnawed at me, adding another layer of complexity to an already painful situation. I decided to confront Emily one final time. Not to reconcile, I knew that ship had sailed, but to get the answers I needed to fully close this chapter of my life. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe where we'd once spent lazy Sunday mornings together. Seeing her again was surreal. She looked tired, her eyes lacking the spark that had once drawn me to her. Our conversation was tense but civil. I asked her about Andrew's claims, about whether she'd been unhappy in our marriage. At first, she deflected, but eventually, she admitted that there had been moments when she'd felt disconnected. She spoke about the challenges of my job, the loneliness of my absences, and her growing sense that we were drifting apart. But what struck me most was her admission that she hadn't tried to fix things. Instead of talking to me, she'd sought solace elsewhere, convincing herself that it was easier than facing the truth. Her words were like a double-edged sword. On one hand, they provided some clarity. On the other, they deepened the pain. Knowing that she'd chosen not to fight for us felt like the ultimate betrayal. Still, I thanked her for her honesty and told her that I hoped she'd find whatever it was she was looking for. Then I walked away, leaving her sitting at the table as I stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The days that followed were a mix of relief and sadness. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again, unburdened by the weight of suspicion and heartbreak. But there was also an emptiness, a lingering ache for the life I'd thought we were building together. It would take time to heal, I knew that. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path.
How was the video? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you in the next video. Bye bye.